these are not all conservative students that are coming up to you and they're downloading your videos and listening to your podcast. And it's not, even though it is a lot of young men, it's not all men.
Right.
What do you think drives people to the message and to the things that you talk about?
Oh, I think it's that I'm believable. And, well, that's why. That's why. I mean, you know, in most of my lectures, so I've done about 150 public lectures or so in the last year, all over the world, and to large audiences. The audiences in Australia were starting to approach, well, we had audiences of 5,500 people in Australia. So, which is quite remarkable, you know, that 5,500 people would come to listen to like a serious discussion about philosophical, theological, and psychological issues, and to participate in that. And I don't pull any punches. I'm not speaking down. I would never speak down to an audience. I think that's a dreadful error of arrogance. But the reason that I think people believe what I say is that I'm very pessimistic. Well, look, because most times when you listen to someone who's a motivational speaker, let's say, you know, it fills you with a temporary optimism, but you go home and the wiser part of you knows that mostly it's the painting over of rotten wood with a fresh coat of paint. And I tell my audiences very clearly that their life is going to be difficult, and sometimes difficult beyond both imagining and tolerance, and that is definitely in your future, if it isn't in your present, and for many people it's in their present, and that can be unbearable, that enough to turn you against life itself, to corrupt you, to drive you to nihilism, to drive you to suicide, and worse, to drive you to thoughts of vengefulness, of infinite scope, to not only be turned against yourself and your fellow men, but to be turned against being itself because of its intrinsically brutal, in some sense, nature. And that it's worse than that, actually, because it's not only that we suffer, and that will necessarily occur, but that we all make our suffering worse because of our ignorance and our malevolence. And everyone knows that to be true. And so the discussions start, let's say, on an unshakable foundation. But then I can tell people, look, despite that, we're remarkable creatures. You know, we're capable of taking up the burden of that suffering and facing the reality of that malevolence voluntarily. We can actually do that. And all of the psychological evidence suggests, and this is independent of your school of psychology, if you're a practical psychologist, a clinical psychologist of any sort, the evidence is crystal clear that if people voluntarily confront the problems that face them and the malevolence that surrounds them, that they can make headway against it. And not only psychologically. So it's not only meaningful to do that psychologically, which it is, to confront the problems that torment you voluntarily. That's meaningful psychologically. But it's also practically useful in that you can actually solve some of the problems that beset you. And God only knows how good we could get at that. You know, I mean, I don't know what percentage of human effort is spent in counterproductive activity. You know, I'm not an absolute cynic about that, but I mean, when I talk to undergraduates, I ask them, you know, how much time do you waste every day by your own reckoning? And it's somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. You know, it's a lot of time. Well, and I usually walk the students through an economic analysis of that. I said, well, you know, why don't you value your time at $50 an hour and calculate for yourself just exactly what you're doing to your future by your inability to discipline yourself. It's worth thinking through. In any case, people do waste a lot of time, and they also act counterproductively a lot of the time. Regardless, we do make progress, and we can thrive under the difficult conditions that make up our lives, and we can resist the malevolence that entices us. That's within our power, and we don't know the limits to that. And we also know that it's better to, we all know this, that it's better to live courageously than cowardly. Everyone knows that. That's what you teach people that you love. And we know that it's better to live truthfully than in deceit. And you can tell that too, because that's also what you tell people that you love. And we know that you should pick up your damn responsibility and move forward. Everyone knows that. It's part of our intrinsic moral nature. And that nature is there. And it's not difficult to communicate to people about this. Like, everyone knows that you wake up at 3 in the morning when you've let your life go off the rails, and that you berate yourself for your uselessness and your cruelty and your failure to take the opportunities that are in front of you. And if you were the master in your own house, in some sense, the captain of your own destiny, if there was no intrinsic nature, well, that would never happen. You'd just let yourself off the hook. There'd be no voice of conscience tormenting you. But no one escapes from that. And what that indicates, to me, is that, at least psychologically, we live in a universe that's characterized by a moral dimension, and we understand that well, and that moral failings have consequences, and that they're not trivial. They destroy you. They destroy your family. They destroy your community. And you can tell people that, and they listen because they know. They don't know they know. That's the thing, and maybe that's the thing about being an intellectual. You have the opportunity to articulate ideas that other people know, they embody, but they can't articulate. And that's what people tell me. They say, well, you help me give words to things that I always knew to be true but couldn't say. Or they say, I've been trying to put some of your precepts into practice. Responsibility being a main one, vision another, honesty, I suppose, bringing up the pack and saying, and this is the fun part of doing all of this. Fun is a weak word. That it's the remarkable part of doing all this. I mean, I have people tell me constantly wherever I go. It's so delightful that, they were in a pretty dark place, and they tell me why. And there's plenty of dark places in the world, and they decided, well, maybe they were going to develop a bit of a vision and take a bit more responsibility and start telling the truth and putting some effort into something. And they come up and they say, well, you can't believe how much better things are. It's like, I got 3 promotions. I had one guy tell me, this was a lovely story, 15 seconds. He came up after a talk. He said, 2 years ago, I got out of jail. I was homeless. He said, I own my own house. I have a 6-figure income. I got married and I have a daughter. Thank you. And that was the whole conversation. It's like he decided he was going to put his life together. And and so you can look at that pessimism that constitutes, let's say, the core of what, well, I think it's the core religious message, really, is the tragic nature of the world, the reality of suffering. It's part of the core religious message. But what emerges out of that, properly conceptualized, is a remarkable appreciation for what human beings are capable of. Like, we are unbelievably resilient and able creatures, and we do not have any conception of our upper limit.